Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The Christmas lights that line the streets of Leon Valley, Texas in December 2023 burned with the kind of cheerfulness that only makes grief feel heavier by contrast. Families were baking, children were sleeping fitfully, and the warm San Antonio air carried the scent of cedar and anticipation. For 18-year-old Savannah Nicole Soto, the holiday season carried a meaning more profound than most. She was not simply counting down to Christmas. She was counting down to the birth of her son. Savannah was petite, barely 5 feet tall, with dark brown eyes that carried a quiet weight behind their warmth. She had grown up in Leon Valley, a modest and close-knit community nestled on the western edge of San Antonio's vast urban sprawl, in a family that had already known more than its share of loss. In 2022, her older brother Ethan had been shot and killed, a tragedy that had devastated the core of a family and left a permanent scar on Savannah's young life. She had sat in a courtroom later that year and watched a man named Nathaniel Rivas face justice for her brother's murder, carrying all the complicated feelings that come with such moments. The relief that truth had been heard, the grief that no verdict could truly heal. She was still carrying those feelings when she discovered she was pregnant. In some ways, the baby felt like a continuation of something, a life emerging from the wreckage of another, the way wildflowers sometimes push through cracked concrete. The baby's father was 22-year-old Matthew Guerra, a young man whose magnetic presence masked a life lived close to the edge. Matthew and Savannah shared an apartment on Grissom Road in Leon Valley. They had given their son a name already, Fabian, and the name carried the weight of all the hope they were pinning on his arrival. By December 2023, Savannah was 9 months pregnant and already a week past her due date. Her doctor had scheduled her for a labor induction at Stone Oak Methodist Hospital for the morning of Saturday, December 23rd. The appointment felt like a finish line. After months of waiting, after all the kicks and cravings and sleepless nights, Fabian would finally arrive in time for Christmas. But the life surrounding that anticipated joy was not without its fractures. Matthew Guerra had pleaded guilty in 2022 to assaulting Savannah on Christmas Day and had been placed on probation. He was also, by multiple accounts and his own social media presence, involved in the drug trade, posting photographs of cash and narcotics on his Instagram page with a casualness that suggested he did not fully grasp the danger in which he was operating. He had been shot at before. Dangerous people knew his name, but she was not part of any of it. She was simply a young woman who loved a complicated man, and she was days away from becoming a mother. None of that complexity mattered to Fabian. He was waiting. The evening of Thursday, December 21st, 2023 began like any other. The apartment on Grissom Road was quiet, and somewhere in the neighborhood, Christmas music drifted from a window or a car. Matthew Guerra had been communicating through Instagram with a 19-year-old named Christopher Preciado, arranging what was ostensibly drug sale. It was the kind of transaction that had probably happened dozens of times before. A quick drive, an exchange, a few minutes of small talk, and then home. Simple. Routine. The sort of thing that, on most nights, amounted to nothing. Savannah went with him. Whether she came by her own choice, whether Matthew asked her along, whether she simply could not bear to be left alone so close to her due date, none of that has been publicly established. What is known is that she was in Matthew's gray Kia Optima when he drove to Christopher Preciado's home on Charlie Chan Drive, a quiet residential street in the Leon Valley area. She was 9 months pregnant. She was 18 years old. She had an appointment in the morning to meet her son. What happened inside that house, or just outside it, has never been fully reconstructed from any neutral source. Both Savannah Soto and Matthew Guerra were shot in the head that night. Matthew's fatal wound was a contact gunshot, meaning the barrel of the gun had been pressed directly against his skull when it was fired. Contact wounds do not happen in panicked struggles. They do not happen by accident. They happen when someone has already subdued another person, when someone has made a decision, when violence has already fully arrived and chosen its form. Fabian, unborn, nameless to anyone except the two young people who had named him, died as well. 3 lives extinguished on a December Thursday night, a day and a half before Christmas. The house on Charlie Chan Drive fell silent. Christopher Preciado, alone with what he had done, made a decision that would set off a chain of concealment lasting more than a week. He picked up his phone and called his father. Ramon Preciado was 53 years old, and whatever went through his mind in those moments, the instinctive protectiveness of a parent, the cold calculus of consequences, or simply the stunned paralysis of someone confronted with the unthinkable, he chose to help his son cover what had happened. He drove to Christopher's location. Together, they lifted the bodies of Savannah Soto and Matthew Guerra and placed them inside the gray Kia Optima, the same car that had brought them there. Just before midnight, the Kia Optima pulled into the parking lot of the Colinas at Medical Apartments complex on Danny K. Drive, a different apartment building in the Leon Valley area. Directly behind it came a gray Chevrolet Silverado, moving with its headlights off. Surveillance cameras mounted on the building recorded what happened next with the patient indifference that cameras have, capturing everything without commentary, without mercy. The Silverado stopped. A heavy-set man stepped out. He walked to the driver's side door of the Kia Optima and wiped the exterior door handle with a towel, methodically removing fingerprints. Then the Kia was driven behind the building, out of immediate sight, parked in a spot where it would not be immediately noticed. By 12 minutes past midnight, the Silverado was gone. The Optima remained where it had been left, behind the apartment building, in the shadows of the December night. Inside it, Savannah Soto was curled in the front seat reclined, her pregnant body arranged to look, perhaps, as though she was simply sleeping. Christmas arrived. Then Christmas Eve. The Kia Optima sat undisturbed behind the apartment complex while the city celebrated and mourned in its own complicated holiday ways. For Gloria Cordova, the fear began to crystallize on Saturday morning, December 23rd, when the hospital called. Savannah had not shown up for her labor induction appointment. She had not answered her phone, had not responded to any messages. Gloria drove to the Grissom Road apartment and knocked on the door. Silence answered her. She tried Matthew's number. No response. She stood at that door and felt the particular terror that parents feel when the silence on the other side of a door stops being an inconvenience and becomes something else entirely, something with shape and weight. That evening, she sat down and wrote a Facebook post. "If you see her," she wrote, "please reach out to me. I'm worried about her safety." She included a photograph. Savannah's face, young, dark-eyed, visibly pregnant, spread across the internet over the next few days as family and community members shared and reshared the post, as strangers added their own pleas, as the phone lines of people who might know something began to ring. Christmas Day brought official intervention. The Texas Department of Public Safety issued a clear alert, a statewide coordinated law enforcement adult rescue notification, describing Savannah as a pregnant woman in imminent danger. The words had been chosen carefully. They conveyed urgency while stopping short of confirmation, but anyone who read them felt the weight of what they suggested. Family members searched. They walked parking lots, knocked on doors, checked with hospitals across the city. They checked with shelters, with friends of friends, with anyone who might have seen or heard anything. The days accumulated with the peculiar slowness that crisis time has, every hour feeling like a week, every unanswered message a small additional wound. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, a resident of the Colinas at Medical Apartments noticed the gray Kia Optima parked behind their building. It had been there for days. Something about it felt wrong. The stillness of it, the way no one ever seemed to come or go from it. The resident took a photograph and sent it to the family, who had been circulating descriptions of Matthew's car as part of their search. The family recognized it immediately. They called the police. San Antonio Police Chief William McManus drove to the scene himself. The Kia Optima was opened, and inside, investigators found the bodies of a young woman and a young man. The woman was 9 months pregnant. Chief McManus stood before reporters that afternoon and described the case as very complex, very, very perplexing. He did not elaborate on the specific nature of the wounds or the circumstances beyond the essentials. He did not need to. The city understood enough. 3 days after the discovery, the medical examiner confirmed what the physical evidence had already whispered. Both victims had been shot in the head. Matthew Guerra's wound was a contact shot, fired at point-blank range. The case was formally classified as capital murder, with 3 victims named: Savannah Nicole Soto, Matthew Guerra, and their unborn son Fabian. The naming of an unborn child as a murder victim carries specific legal weight in Texas, where the law recognizes the life of a fetus under the state's homicide statute. It was a legal distinction, yes, but it was also an acknowledgement of something human and irreducible. 3 people had gone into that night. 3 people had not come back. The investigation began to move quickly once the bodies were found, driven by the focused energy that homicide detectives pour into cases with victims this young, this vulnerable, this close to a life just beginning. Inside the Kia Optima, investigators found shell casings but no firearm. Blood transfer on the car's exterior confirmed the obvious. The murders had not occurred in the apartment parking lot. The bodies had been moved after death. Someone had staged the scene, dressed it in the borrowed costume of an abandoned car. The digital trail was the first to crack the case open. One of the victims' cell phones contained a recent Google Maps search, an address on Charlie Chan Drive. Investigators pulled up the address. When they switched to street-level imagery in the mapping application, they spotted it immediately: a gray Chevrolet Silverado sitting in the driveway of the property. It matched the vehicle captured on the apartment complex surveillance footage from the night the car had been abandoned. Within hours, investigators had identified the vehicle's owner. The address on Charlie Chan Drive connected to the Preciado family, to Christopher Preciado, 19 years old, and to his father Ramon. Detectives began the painstaking process of assembling the timeline, pulling phone records, reviewing surveillance footage from multiple cameras across the neighborhood, cross-referencing the GPS coordinates embedded in the footage timestamps with the known movements of the Silverado and the Optima. The picture that emerged was one of premeditation and deliberate concealment. A killing followed by a phone call to a father, 2 men working together to hide what had been done, a dead young woman and her boyfriend driven across the city in the dark while the people who loved them rang phones that would never be answered. On January 3rd and 4th, 2024, San Antonio police made their arrests. Christopher Preciado and Ramon Preciado were taken into custody. Christopher was charged with 3 counts of capital murder. Ramon was charged with tampering with evidence, specifically with concealing human remains. A third person, Murta Romanos, Christopher's mother, was also eventually charged in connection with the concealment, accused of having knowledge of what had occurred. Christopher Preciado, when detectives sat across from him and asked what had happened that night, offered a version of events that presented himself as the victim. He said that Matthew Guerra had pointed a gun at him. He claimed that he had reached out and manipulated the weapon, that the shots had been accidental, that he had not intended for anyone to die. He said the word manipulated, as though it could carry the weight of 2 deaths and an unborn child's life. He said it as though it could explain away the contact wound on Matthew Guerra's skull, the forensic impossibility of an accidental trigger pull-pressed against someone's head. The story did not hold. The physical evidence contradicted it at nearly every point. The medical examiner's findings contradicted it. The absence of any recovered firearm belonging to Matthew Guerra contradicted it. The deliberate, organized nature of the concealment, the Silverado arriving with its lights off, the methodical wiping of the door handle, the strategic choice of an out-of-the-way parking lot, painted a picture not of panic but of calculation. Gloria Cordova sat with all of this. She sat with the knowledge that her daughter had been in the passenger seat of a car that drove to a stranger's house, that she had never left that house alive, that she had spent Christmas and the day after Christmas in a gray car behind an apartment building while her family knocked on doors and posted photographs on Facebook. She sat with the knowledge that Fabian, whose name she had known for months, would never take a breath. The grief of losing a child is unlike other griefs. It rewires something in a person, rearranges the furniture of their interior world, so that certain rooms are never the same again. Gloria had already lost Ethan. Now she had lost Savannah. Now she had lost a grandson she had never held. She did not stay silent. She became a presence at hearings, at press conferences, in the media coverage of the case. A mother demanding that the system she had already once relied upon for Ethan's case would hold together long enough to deliver justice for her daughter. When one defendant walked free on reduced or dismissed charges, she spoke. When delays mounted, she spoke. Her grief had a voice, and she used it. The road to justice was neither clean nor swift. In November 2025, charges against Murder Romanos were dismissed, a legal decision that was deeply painful for Savannah's family, who had wanted everyone who played a role in the concealment to face full accountability. Ramon Preciado's case moved through the courts on its own timeline, but it was Christopher Preciado who faced the most serious charge, and it was his trial that the family had been waiting for across 2 years of grief and legal procedure. In March 2026, Christopher Preciado stood trial in a Bexar County courtroom on 3 counts of capital murder. The jury heard the forensic evidence. They heard about the contact gunshot wound. They saw the surveillance footage from the Colinas at medical apartments, the Silverado arriving in the dark with its headlights off, the methodical wiping of the door handle, the careful staging of a scene meant to delay and confuse. They heard about the cell phone search that had pointed investigators toward Charlie Chan Drive. They heard about Savannah Soto, 18 years old, 9 months pregnant, the induction appointment she never kept, the son she never held. On March 25, 2026, the jury returned its verdict, guilty. Christopher Preciado was found guilty of capital murder in the deaths of Savannah Nicole Soto, Matthew Guerra, and their unborn son Fabian. Outside the courthouse, the family wept, not with joy because there is no joy in these moments, but with the particular release of people who have been holding their breath for 2 years and 2 months and who have finally been given permission to exhale. Victim impact statements were read aloud in the courtroom. The names of 3 people who deserved futures were spoken into the record. Savannah Soto had been 18 years old, a week from meeting her son, a young woman who had already survived tremendous loss, and who was trying to build something good from the pieces life had given her. She had loved a complicated man in a dangerous world, and that love had placed her in a car on a December night, and the rest had unfolded with the terrible logic of a tragedy that should never have happened. She deserved more Decembers. Fabian deserved his first one. The lights of Leon Valley still come on every Christmas, the way they always have, strung along fences and rooftops, casting their cheerful glow over a neighborhood that carries its scars quietly, the way all places do. Somewhere in that neighborhood, a family gathers each year with one empty chair more than there should be, and then another empty chair, and the shadow of a child who never arrived. The holidays, for the court of a family, will always carry the particular weight of the week when the world kept celebrating while their daughter lay hidden in a gray car behind an apartment building, waiting to be found. She was found. The truth was found. And in the cold, insufficient way that justice sometimes manages, the person responsible was held to account. It is not enough. It never is. But it is what the law could give, and Gloria Cordova, who had already sat in one courtroom for one murdered child, and who had now sat in another, accepted it with the quiet, indestructible dignity of a mother who refuses to let her daughter's name be forgotten. Savannah Nicole Soto, Matthew Guerra, Fabian, 3 names that should have had longer stories. Story 2. The loneliness that belongs to children who grow up without a permanent home. A hollow, restless feeling that comes from never quite belonging anywhere, from sleeping in beds that are always someone else's, from learning early that the world is unreliable and that affection is always conditional. Caitlin Coons knew this loneliness intimately. By the time she was 17 years old, she had already spent years cycling through foster homes in Cleveland, Akron, and Canton, Ohio, each placement a temporary shelter, and each departure a reminder that she had nowhere permanent to go. She had a history of running away, of reaching for things beyond her grasp, of looking for something, anything, that felt like belonging. She found it, or believed she did, in the worst possible place. Jonathan Jones was 33 years old, a man who had grown up in the quietly unremarkable suburb of Sylvania Township, about 13 miles west of Toledo, Ohio. He still lived at home, in the house he shared with his mother, Nicole Jones, a woman of 53 who cooked and cleaned and kept the lights on and watched over her adult son with the particular weariness of a parent who has never quite been able to let go. Nicole was, by all accounts, a devoted mother, perhaps too devoted, in the way that parents sometimes are when their children struggle to find their footing in the world. She managed the house, paid the bills, and tried to provide stability for a son who seemed perpetually unable to provide it for himself. What Nicole did not know, and could not have known, was the nature of the relationship her son had already cultivated with a teenager barely older than a child. It had begun years earlier, when Caitlin was just 15 or 16 years old, still a ward of Stark County Children's Services, living in foster care, utterly vulnerable to adult influence. Jonathan had met her somehow, in circumstances that he had drawn her into his world. He had taken her to a Super 8 motel and had had physical relations with her when she was barely past 15. He had taken nude photographs. He had intended, apparently, to distribute them. In March 2023, he pleaded guilty in Wood County to charges of endangering children and attempting to commit pandering obscenity involving a minor. He was fitted with an electronic monitoring bracelet, ordered to appear for sentencing in May, and released. For Caitlin, none of this was a warning. For her, Jonathan Jones was not a predator. He was, in the distorted logic of a child who had known very little love, the person who wanted her, who picked her up, who made her feel chosen. This was not love at all, but something called trauma bonding, the psychological phenomenon in which a vulnerable person becomes deeply attached to their abuser, mistaking control and dependency for devotion. Whether or not that argument fully captured the truth of what existed between them, one thing was clear. By April 2023, Caitlin Coons was willing to do anything to preserve what she believed they had. On April 18, 2023, Caitlin disappeared from the group home in Canton, where she had been placed by Stark County Children's Services. It was not the first time she had run. According to records filed in Stark County Family Court, she had previously fled foster homes in Cleveland and Akron, and had vanished from a Canton home as far back as 2020. Running was something she knew how to do. But this time, she was running towards something specific and towards someone who was waiting. Jonathan picked her up from a nearby restaurant and drove her back to the house on the edge of Sylvania Township, the house where his mother lived, the house where Nicole Jones, entirely unaware, was going about the business of her ordinary day. Because Nicole did not approve of her son's connection to a teenage girl, because she had not consented to the arrangement, Caitlin had to enter the house by climbing through a window, slipping inside like a shadow, hiding herself in the room of a 33-year-old man in his mother's home. It was a strange kind of hiding, and yet to Caitlin, it may have felt like exactly the kind of secret life that made the whole arrangement feel electric and significant. They were together, hidden, and for now, that seemed to be enough. But it quickly became clear that the arrangement could not last. Nicole was present in the house. Nicole was a problem. Caitlin had decided that the problem needed to be resolved in the most absolute and irrevocable way imaginable. Within days of her arrival, Caitlin issued an ultimatum that she told Jonathan Jones, the man she believed loved her, that his mother was standing in the way of their life together. That Nicole's presence, her disapproval, her very existence in that house was the obstacle between them and everything they could have. And then she gave him a deadline. 5 hours. 5 hours to do something about his mother. And at one point during her interview with investigators, she had even used the word kill. The weight of what was being asked of him seems, in those hours, to have been too much even for Jonathan Jones. He stayed in the living room. He did not act. 5 hours passed, and he had not moved. Then Caitlin extended the deadline by 1 more hour, and still nothing happened. The man who had pursued and groomed a child, who had compromised her in motels and photographed her and run with her toward a border, this same man could not bring himself to harm his own mother. And so Caitlin decided to do it herself. What happened next was Caitlin walked outside the house and searched the ground until she found a rock. She came back in through the kitchen, moving quietly, deliberately. Nicole Jones was standing at her refrigerator, in her own kitchen, in her own home, on an ordinary April afternoon, entirely unaware that a teenager was behind her, holding a rock. The blows came without warning. Nicole never had the chance to turn around, to understand what was happening. to defend herself. Caitlin bludgeoned her multiple times, and when that alone did not end it, she strangled her. The woman who had tried to protect her household, who had perhaps sensed that something was wrong and had tried in her maternal way to stop it, died in her kitchen without ever understanding why. Jonathan Jones was in the living room throughout. He heard. He knew. He did not intervene to save his mother. He did not call for help. When it was over, and Caitlin came to find him, the two of them drove together to a nearby store and bought a tarp and plastic trash bags. They returned to the house, wrapped Nicole's body, and loaded it into her own car, a Buick Encore that she would never drive again. They drove to an apartment complex not far from the house, found a dumpster, and put Nicole Jones inside it. The dumpster would eventually be collected and taken to a landfill. Nicole's body has never been recovered. That evening, or perhaps shortly after, something shifted in Caitlin. Whatever rush of certainty or desperation had carried her through the afternoon had not erased the reality of what she had done. She reached for her phone and sent a text message to a nurse at the group home she had run away from. A message so raw and so staggering that it triggered an immediate chain of events. She told the nurse she was on the run. She said she had killed 2 people. She said one of them was her boyfriend's mother. It was an extraordinary thing to do, to confess voluntarily to a caretaker she had fled, and its meaning has been interpreted in different ways. Some saw it as evidence of guilt, of the weight of what she had done pressing through whatever shell she had constructed around herself. Others saw it as the act of a damaged young person who had never fully understood consequences, who had been shaped by years of instability into someone incapable of fully measuring the real from the surreal. Whatever the reason, the message was received, and it set everything in motion. Canton police contacted the Sylvania Township Police Department, who immediately went to Nicole Jones's address. She was not there. The house was clean, but something about it felt wrong. On May 5th, a formal welfare check was conducted, and on May 11th, Nicole Jones was officially reported as missing. Investigators who entered the home found evidence that matched almost precisely what Caitlin had described in her confession. What they find, one detective told a local television station, matches almost exactly what she has explained as the crime as it occurred. By then, Caitlin and Jonathan were already gone. The U.S. Marshals Service and the Northern Ohio Violent Fugitive Task Force launched a nationwide manhunt. Social media erupted with posts about a missing teenager, many people initially assuming that Caitlin, a minor, had been abducted by a dangerous older man. There were concerned appeals, shared photographs, the language of a child in danger. The reality was far more complicated and far darker. Jonathan Jones was already a wanted man before the murder. By missing his May 4th sentencing date, the one related to his earlier convictions for child endangerment and obscenity, he had violated the terms of his release and a warrant had been issued for his arrest. He was being electronically monitored. But instead of going to court, he drove toward the border with a teenage girl and the credit cards, identification documents, and phone of his dead mother in the car. Nicole's belongings, her license, her bank cards, were being used as though she were simply absent on a trip, as though a woman had not been bludgeoned in her own kitchen and disposed of in a dumpster. What Jonathan did not fully reckon with was the GPS tracking device he still wore on his ankle from his March conviction. He apparently failed to deactivate it. On May 6th, Nicole's Buick Encore was spotted in Cochise, Arizona, near the Mexican border. On May 8th, both Jonathan Jones and Caitlin Coons were located and arrested in Ahumada, in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. In the car, authorities found Nicole's credit cards, her license, her identification, and a backpack with what appeared to be blood on it. The nationwide manhunt that had begun as a search for a missing teenager ended at the Mexican border with the arrest of the 2 people responsible for that teenager's crimes. When investigators interviewed Caitlin after she was brought back across the border, she did not hold back. She confessed to the killing. She provided details, specific, verifiable details, about the location of Nicole's body that matched the GPS data tracked from Jonathan Jones's phone. The dumpster had already been emptied. The landfill had already swallowed what remained. The legal proceedings that followed were layered with complexity and grief. Caitlin, still 17 at the time of her arrest, was charged in juvenile court with felony obstruction. Then, on November 17, 2023, A judge certified her to be tried as an adult, a decision that reflected the severity of what she had done, but which also raised profound questions about culpability, about childhood, about what it means to hold a broken child to the fullest account of adult law. She was charged with aggravated murder, felonious assault, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. Jonathan faced those same charges plus aggravated burglary and aggravated robbery. Her defense attorney and Barones argued forcefully that Caitlin was herself a victim, that the man standing beside her in the defendant's dock had groomed her since she was a child, had sexually exploited her, had taken her from her foster home and molded her into someone capable of violence in service of his own ends. The attorney invoked the concept of trauma bonding, the idea that years of manipulation by an adult predator had warped Caitlin's sense of reality, of loyalty, of what love meant and what it demanded. There was no disputing that Jonathan Jones had done terrible things to Caitlin before any of this began. He had pleaded guilty to it. The age gap, 16 years between them, was not merely uncomfortable. It was a gap in power and experience so vast that it had shaped everything that followed. The question before the court was not whether Caitlin had been failed by the adults in her life, because clearly she had. The question was whether a failed childhood could explain, not excuse, but explain, how a 17-year-old girl had walked outside to pick up a rock and walked back in to use it on a woman who had done nothing to her. On June 4, 2024, both Caitlin Coons and Jonathan Jones entered pleas of no contest to charges of aggravated murder and abuse of a corpse. The no contest plea meant neither admitted guilt in the strict legal sense, but neither contested the facts as laid out by prosecutors. A judge accepted the pleas and sentenced both defendants to life in prison. Under Ohio law, they would be eligible to apply for parole after serving 25 years. Caitlin was 18 years old at sentencing, a year older than she had been when Nicole Jones was killed. She had spent that intervening year in detention, waiting, while the courts decided what her future would be. Her future, as it now stood, would begin again, if it began at all, when she was 43 years old, assuming a parole board one day agreed. Lucas County Prosecutor Julia Bates addressed the press after sentencing with measured words that carried the full weight of what the case had cost. "This was a horrific event," she said. "We are relieved to reach a resolution in this case. We hope this brings some measure of peace to Nicole Jones's family. May her memory forever live in their hearts." Nicole Jones's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Caitlin Coons and Jonathan Jones in Lucas County, seeking damages in excess of $25,000 plus punitive relief. It was a legal instrument designed, as such instruments often are, not only for financial remedy, but for the insistence that a life had value, that its ending demanded acknowledgement, that the person who had stood at her refrigerator on an April afternoon had been a real woman whose loss rippled outward into lives that still ached with her absence. Nicole Jones's body was never found. Somewhere in a landfill, in the landscape of Ohio's industrial heartland, she rests in a place her family cannot visit, cannot mark with flowers, cannot stand beside when the grief becomes too heavy to carry alone. She has no grave. She has no marker. She has only the courtroom record, the photographs entered into evidence, the testimony of detectives who described the aftermath of her death, and the memories of the people who loved her. The case of Caitlin Coons resists simple categorization. She was a perpetrator of a brutal, premeditated murder. There is no softening that, no narrative frame that changes what was done. Nicole Jones was an innocent woman who died because she disapproved of her son's relationship with a teenager, which is perhaps the most ordinary and reasonable maternal judgment imaginable. She was killed for that, and the system that was supposed to protect Caitlin, the foster care network, the child services apparatus, the courts that had already identified Jonathan Jones as a danger to minors and still allowed him his freedom, had failed at every turn to keep them apart. Jonathan Jones had been convicted of crimes against Caitlin before the murder. He had been fitted with a monitoring device and sent back into the world. He had continued to pursue her, pick her up, smuggle her into his house. And the teenage girl at the center of it all, shaped by years of instability and exploitation, had made a choice, a violent, irreversible, unforgivable choice, that would define the rest of her life and end someone else's entirely. In the end, the case left 3 lives destroyed. Nicole Jones, who never came home, Jonathan Jones, who spent years grooming a child and watched that child become a killer in his own kitchen, and Caitlin Coons herself, who will spend the most formative decades of her life behind prison walls, carrying the weight of what she did in a moment whose consequences no 17-year-old, no matter how fractured, no matter how manipulated, could ever have been prepared to live with. Story 3. Barcelona in February carries a chill, not the bitter, bone-deep cold of northern Europe, but a damp, gray coolness that rolls off the Mediterranean and settles into the narrow medieval streets of the old city like fog finding the low places. It is not the Barcelona of postcards, all sunlight and gaudy, and the smell of the sea. It is the Barcelona of February, quieter, more introspective, a city that has pulled its coat a little tighter. On February 19, 2008, it was in one of these quieter streets, inside a rented apartment in the Gracia neighborhood, that a woman named Ana Páez was found dead. She was 35 years old. She had gone to meet a friend for dinner, and she had never come home. Her story does not begin on that cold February night. It begins, as so many tragedies do, much earlier, in trust, in friendship, in the slow and invisible accumulation of one person's obsession with another's life. Ana Maria Páez Capitan was the kind of woman whose steadiness other people found reassuring. She worked as a fashion designer, a profession that suited her. She had an eye for beauty, for the careful architecture of things that would be seen and worn and experienced by other people. She lived and worked in Barcelona, that most design-conscious of Spanish cities, and she moved through her professional world with quiet competence. She was in a loving relationship with a man named Carlos Carbejo, and she shared a close, warm bond with her brother Tony. Her life, from the outside, looked like the life of someone who had worked hard for a good thing and earned it. She had met Maria Angeles Molina Fernandez approximately 10 years before her death, when both women worked at the same company. Maria Angeles, who preferred to be called Angie, a nickname she wore like a costume, was older than Ana, and she presented herself as everything Ana might one day aspire to be. Angie was, by her own telling, and by the telling of those who knew her in those years, a successful businesswoman. She had money, connections, a Porsche, the easy confidence of someone who had arrived somewhere. She was cultured and generous, the type of person who knew the right restaurants, who offered advice with the authority of someone who had already made all the mistakes worth making, who treated her friends with an expansive warmth that could easily be mistaken for love. Ana trusted her completely. Over 10 years, the friendship had deepened, or appeared to. Angie had been a mentor as much as a friend, a guiding presence in Anna's professional and personal world, someone who seemed to want good things for her. In the architecture of Anna's emotional life, Angie occupied a weight-bearing wall. Ana could not have known that the wall was hollow. She could not have known that the person she had trusted for a decade had, for at least 2 of those years, been systematically dismantling everything Ana had built, stealing it piece by piece, document by document, while smiling warmly across restaurant tables and making plans for dinner. The plan was one of the most coldly premeditated financial crimes ever prosecuted in Spain. It had begun, the evidence showed, in or around April 2006, nearly 2 years before Anna's murder. At some point in those years of friendship, Angie had gained access to Anna's personal identity documents, perhaps through a moment of ordinary trust, a document left carelessly on a table, a favor that involved paperwork, the kind of small vulnerability that friends extend to each other without a second thought. However she obtained them, she used them. She began, carefully and methodically, to become Ana Páez, not in the obvious, clumsily detectable way of an amateur. Angie was intelligent, and she was patient. She obtained loans in Anna's name. She took out life insurance policies, multiple policies from different institutions, naming Ana as the insured. The total financial value of the policies and loans she had secured in Anna's name had climbed, by the time of the murder, to more than 1 million euros. She also assumed the identity of a second woman, Susanna B., who had unknowingly left her identity card at a photocopying shop. Angie had lifted it and used it to open bank accounts and conduct fraudulent transactions. It was a financial scheme of considerable complexity, built on stolen identities and manufactured paperwork, constructed with the patience of someone who intended never to be caught. There was one problem with the plan, one structural weakness that Angie had known about from the beginning and had always intended to address. The loans and the insurance policies were taken out in Anna Paz's name. Eventually, those debts and premiums would come due. Banks would look for Anna Paz. Insurance investigators would call her. The scheme could only sustain itself for so long before the real Anna Paz became a liability, before her continued existence became the one thing standing between Angie and the money she had spent 2 years accumulating in another woman's name. At some point, Angie decided to solve that problem. She planned the murder the way she had planned everything else, with patience, with precision, with an attention to detail that suggested she had spent considerable time thinking about what could go wrong and working backward from there. She rented a short-stay tourist apartment in the Gracia neighborhood of Barcelona, using Anna's name to do so, for a period of just 3 days. 3 days was long enough for what she needed and short enough to limit exposure. She chose an apartment and not her own home for reasons that were obvious. She did not want to clean what was about to happen out of her own walls. The morning of February 19, 2008, she dressed carefully and put on a black wig. She walked into a bank and withdrew €600 from an account held in Anna's name. The bank's surveillance cameras recorded her doing so. The wig was not quite enough, and the recording would later provide investigators with one of their most important pieces of evidence. But on that morning, Angie was not thinking about cameras. She was thinking about alibis. After withdrawing the money, she drove her Porsche out of Barcelona, heading northeast toward Zaragoza. Her father had died the previous year, and his ashes had been held there. The drive to collect them was real. The ashes were real, but the timing was deliberate and calculated. She was constructing a paper trail that would place her outside Barcelona, a woman on a sad and ordinary errand of grief, nowhere near the apartment in Gracia where her friend would be waiting. It was the kind of move that required a particular disposition, the ability to hold grief as a prop, to use the death of a parent as a chess piece in the game of covering one's own crime. She returned to Barcelona that evening. She called Anna and invited her to dinner at the apartment. Anna Paz got ready and went. What happened inside the apartment in the hours that will never be fully known in the way that a witnessed event is known, because the only 2 people present were a killer and her victim. Angie drugged Anna with a substance whose precise identity could not be determined. There was a bottle of chloroform in Angie's home. The drug rendered Anna helpless. Then Angie placed a plastic bag over Anna's head and sealed it with several strips of duct tape. Anna Paz, fashion designer, daughter, sister, partner, friend, a woman who had spent 10 years trusting the person across the table from her, died in that apartment by suffocation, unable to move, unable to call out, alone in a room with someone she had believed loved her. What came next was perhaps the most disturbing element of an already deeply disturbing crime. Angie had anticipated that the death would be investigated, and she had prepared a misdirection. In the days before the murder, she had visited a male brothel and paid 2 men to provide her with semen, collected in a jar. At the crime scene, she used that semen to simulate the evidence of a sexual encounter, staging the apartment to suggest that Anna had died during a consensual encounter gone wrong. A sex game, an accident, a tragedy without a perpetrator. She left the apartment and went back to her life, confident that the police who found Anna's body would spend their energy looking for a man. It was an act of extraordinary cold calculation, designed not in a moment of panic but in advance, thought through and prepared for, and carried out with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had studied the problem from every angle. Anna's body was discovered on February 19, 2008. She was found in the apartment in Gracia, as Angie had arranged, naked, a plastic bag secured over her head. The scene was, as it had been designed to be, deeply confusing. The initial assessment by the responding officers leaned toward what the staging suggested: a sexual encounter, perhaps consensual, perhaps not, that had ended in death. The investigation began with the wrong question. Not who did this and why, but what kind of man was here last night. It was the kind of misdirection that could have worked. It had been built by someone who understood how investigators think, who understood that the staging of a scene can redirect an entire inquiry for weeks or months, buying time for a perpetrator to distance themselves, discard evidence, and construct an alibi detailed enough to withstand scrutiny. But investigations have their own momentum. And the people who loved Ana Paez, her partner Carlos, her brother Tony, her colleagues and friends, began to speak to detectives about the contours of Anna's life. Her social world was small and known. She had gone to meet someone that evening. Who? The answer, offered by more than one person who knew her, was the same, Angie. Their friend, their former colleague, the woman she had known for 10 years. The surveillance footage from the bank, recorded that same morning, showed a woman in a black wig withdrawing money from an account in Anna's name. The more investigators looked at the footage, the more one face kept suggesting itself. Detectives began to look at Angie not as a grieving friend, but as a person of interest. And once they looked, the edifice she had built began to show its cracks. When investigators searched Angie's home, they found what they needed. Hidden behind the cistern of the bathroom, a concealment so unglamorous, so fundamentally human in its desperate improvisation, was a collection of documents. Ana Paez's original passport, her identity card, they had been taken there and hidden like stolen treasures. The physical artifacts of the identity Angie had been wearing for 2 years. Also recovered was an insurance policy from Carrefour, taken out in Anna's name, and the bottle of chloroform, unopened but present, the tool of the trade, held in reserve. Critically, it was Angie's then-boyfriend who handed these items to investigators. He had found them in the bathroom and understood what they meant. In handing them over, he did the thing that Angie had not anticipated. He introduced a witness into a crime she had constructed to have none. Angie was arrested and charged with the murder of Ana Paez and with multiple counts of document falsification and fraud. She denied everything. In the courtroom, she maintained her innocence with a composure that several observers found unsettling. The same composure, perhaps, with which she had planned the crime and executed it, and driven to Zaragoza to collect her father's ashes while her friend lay dying in a rented apartment. Her alibi, which she delivered with specific and confident details, placed her shopping on the day of the murder, at El Corte Ingles's department store, where she said she had bought a watch, and then at a convenience store. Her explanation for why she had withdrawn money from Anna's account that morning while wearing a black wig was not coherent. Her explanation for why Anna's passport and identity card were hidden behind her bathroom cistern was not offered at all. The trial, which the Spanish media had taken to calling the perfect crime, was, in the end, a dismantling of the very perfection Angie had believed she had achieved. The forensic evidence spoke clearly. The financial records spoke clearly. The bank surveillance footage spoke clearly. The men from the brothel testified in court that a woman had come to them and paid for semen in a jar, and witnesses identified that woman as Angie. The insurance policies, the loans, the fraudulent accounts, a 2-year architecture of deception laid out document by document before the Barcelona High Court. Anna's family sat through all of it. Carlos Carbejo, who had loved Ana and who had believed she was going to dinner with a friend. Tony, her brother, who had grown up alongside her. They listened to forensic pathologists describe how Ana had died. They listened to financial investigators enumerate the ways in which the person they had trusted had spent 2 years preparing to kill her. They listened to the court read back the evidence until the totality of what had been done to Ana Paez occupied every corner of that room. On March 19, 2012, the Barcelona High Court delivered its verdict. The court found it unquestionably proven that Maria Angeles Molina had taken out fraudulent policies and loans using Anna's identity. It found that she had murdered Ana in an act of premeditation, having lured her to the apartment under the pretext of inviting her to dinner. It described the crime as especially perverse, noting that the killing represented the coldest possible betrayal of a friendship that had lasted 10 years. Angie was sentenced to 22 years in prison, 18 for the murder of Ana Paez, and 4 additional years for the falsification of documents in service of fraud. The verdict, when it came, did not close everything. The investigation into the 1996 death of Angie's husband, Juan Antonio Alvarez Litben, had been reopened in the wake of the Paez murder. He had been 45 years old when he died suddenly and under unexplained circumstances. He had been a successful businessman. Angie had inherited his assets. The renewed scrutiny raised serious questions and deep suspicions, questions that aligned too neatly with the pattern of what Angie had done to Ana to be easily dismissed. But the passage of time and the absence of material proof meant that the case of Juan Antonio remained unresolved. It sits in the record as an open question, a haunting shadow alongside the confirmed truth of Anna's murder. What is not in question is this. Ana Páez went to dinner with her friend on the evening of February 19, 2008, and never came home. She was 35 years old. She had spent a decade building a professional life she was proud of, a relationship that sustained her, friendships she believed were real. One of those friendships had been a lie from the moment it began to serve a purpose, or perhaps earlier, perhaps long before anyone could have seen it, the fracture running invisible and quiet through the stone while Anna walked over it every day, trusting the ground beneath her feet. She deserved the life she had been building. She deserved the dinners she thought she was going to, the mornings she would not wake up to see. The years that the court's sentencing acknowledged had been taken from her not in a moment of sudden violence, but through the slow and calculated patience of someone who had decided, long in advance, that Anna's life was worth less than Anna's money. The apartment in Gracia has long since been rented to someone else. The narrow Barcelona streets have moved through 15 more Februaries, their gray chill arriving and passing year after year. But Ana Páez's name endures, spoken in courtrooms, in documentaries, in the careful, quiet grief of a family that lost her. A woman who trusted too well, and whose trust was met with the worst thing that trust can encounter, a plan. Story 4. The morning of Monday, June 13, 2016, began unremarkably for 18-year-old Aaron Lee Pajic-Sweetman. He had always been that kind of young man, quiet, gentle, with an easy smile and a heart full of trust. Aaron lived with Asperger's syndrome, a condition that sat somewhere along the autism spectrum and shaped how he moved through the world. It made him earnest in a way that left him wide open to the goodness and the cruelty of others. He loved video games with a boyish passion, the kind of love that could fill hours without loneliness, and he carried with him an uncomplicated warmth that his family and friends recognized immediately. He was slightly built, soft-spoken, and he believed, in the way that truly good people often do, that those around him wished him well. That morning, his landlady drove him to the Rockingham Centre shopping complex in the southern suburbs of Perth, Western Australia. Aaron was headed there to meet a woman he knew, a woman he had no reason to distrust. He stepped out of the car, disappeared into the bright Australian winter morning, and was never seen alive again. What Aaron did not know, what no one in his life could have imagined, was that the woman waiting for him had spent months preparing for this very moment. Not just preparing, dreaming of it, scheming for it, and she had not done so alone. Gemma Victoria Lilly was 25 years old, originally from the town of Stamford in Lincolnshire, England. Her childhood had been fractured by domestic abuse from her mother, a wound that ran deep beneath the surface of her adult life. When her parents separated, her father took custody of Gemma and her sibling, but by then, something had already shifted inside the girl. At age 6, she had been diagnosed with dyslexia. By age 15, she had developed a fascination that most people around her found unsettling, a consuming obsession with serial killers. She watched films about them. She collected butcher knives. She dressed as them, and she began writing a novel. The book, which centered on a fictional serial killer she called SOS, a name borrowed with dark reverence from the real-life murderer David Berkowitz, known as the Son of Sam. She published it online under the pen name Sin Demon. The character of SOS was not merely a literary exercise. Over the years, Gemma came to inhabit SOS as an alter ego, a version of herself that was cold, dominant, and utterly without remorse. She moved to Perth, Australia, in 2010 at age 18, finding work at a tattoo parlor and later at a Woolworths supermarket. In 2012, she entered a marriage of convenience with a man named Gordon Galbraith, a gay man who was a friend of a friend, allowing her to obtain permanent residency in Australia. When Galbraith died in August 2014, Gemma was left alone in her house in the suburb of Aurelia, a quiet, unremarkable street in the southern sprawl of Perth. It was into this house, and into this woman's life, that Trudy Claire Lenon stepped in May 2016. Trudy was 42 years old, a mother of 3, and in her own way, equally adrift from ordinary life. She and Gemma had connected through Galbraith's social circle, and something in their dynamic locked together with terrible precision. Gemma was the dominant, Trudy was the follower. Gemma was SOS, Trudy was Corvina. When Trudy moved into Gemma's house, the house they began to call Elm Street, after the fictional horror address from the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, the two women entered a world of their own creation, sealed off from the outside by whispered conversations and coded messages. On the 31st of May 2016, in a virtual conversation between the two women, they told each other that they were ready. What they meant was beyond disturbing. Gemma Lilly had long harbored a specific, chilling ambition: to kill a person before she turned 25. It was something she wanted to tick off her bucket list. She had discussed it in messages. She had written about it in her fiction. She had planned it the way one might plan a holiday, systematically, methodically, and without apparent conscience. In the weeks that followed their declaration, the two women went shopping. Not once, but 3 times, between the 16th of May and the 12th of June. Their purchases were meticulous and revealing. A circular saw, acetone, bleach, a large barrel, and 100 liters of hydrochloric acid, bought across 2 separate trips to Bunnings hardware stores to avoid suspicion. There were also other items in their home that told a more complete story. A bone saw, numerous knives, a concealed room, and lists, detailed handwritten lists, of methods of torture and items used to inflict pain. Trudy Linon had known Aaron Pajich because she was a classmate of a friend of his, and the mother of children he sometimes played video games with. He trusted her, in the way that people with Asperger's syndrome often do, building trust through familiarity and routine, taking relationships at face value. Aaron had no reason to question a phone call from Trudy on the morning of June 13th. She invited him over. She offered to pick him up at Rockingham Center. It was a perfectly ordinary thing to do for a perfectly ordinary reason, as far as Aaron understood it. He was told, according to the evidence presented at trial, that he was coming over to download some software. His landlady, who overheard part of the phone call, drove him to the shopping center. And the CCTV cameras at Rockingham Center captured what would become the first piece of a tragic, irrefutable trail of evidence. Trudy Linon's car leaving the car park with Gemma Lilly and Aaron Pajich inside. The camera outside the house on Aurelia captured the rest. Aaron walked through the front door of Elm Street that morning alongside the two women, alive and unsuspecting. He did not walk back out. Inside the house, the attack was swift and vicious. Aaron was choked with a garrote, a wire or cord used to strangle, by Gemma Lilly, while Trudy Linon helped hold him down. The garrote broke during the struggle. Aaron fought back. His body found defense wounds on his hands, evidence that he had raised his arms, tried to protect himself, tried in his final moments to survive. The stab wounds that followed were directed at his neck and chest, severing his jugular vein and puncturing both his liver and his lungs. Because of the severity of the wounds, death had likely come quickly. It was a small mercy in an otherwise merciless act. Afterward, the women laid his body into a shallow grave no more than 30 centimeters deep in the backyard of the Aurelia house. They poured concrete over it. They laid bright red tiles on top. And they went on with their lives. Aaron Pajich was reported missing 2 days after he disappeared, on Wednesday the 15th of June, when he had not returned to the house where he was lodging. For nearly a week, his family and those who loved him lived in the unbearable suspension of not knowing, calling his phone, retracing his steps, holding out the hope that he was simply somewhere unreachable, that he would resurface. Police investigators, meanwhile, began pulling at the threads. Phone records showed that the last call answered on Aaron's mobile had come from Trudy Linon's phone. The CCTV footage from Rockingham Center confirmed he had been in her car that morning. The camera on the Aurelia house confirmed he had entered. Nothing confirmed he had left. On the night of June 20th, a week after his disappearance, police arrived at the house on Elm Street and began to search. When they dug beneath the red tiles in the backyard and broke through the concrete, they found him. A young man barely beginning his life, buried in a shallow grave, as though he had been rubbish to be disposed of. Gemma Lilly and Trudy Linon were arrested the following day, June 21st, and formally charged with murder on June 22nd. Even as the arrest was being processed, Gemma Lilly had already revealed herself in a way that left investigators and prosecutors stunned. Just 5 days after Aaron's disappearance, while his family was still searching and hoping, Lily had approached a colleague at Woolworth's and told him, almost casually, that she and Trudy had killed Aaron. The colleague would become one of the most critical witnesses at trial, recounting how Lily appeared full of herself and euphoric in the days following the murder. She believed, it later emerged, that the police were not clever enough to catch her. She was wrong. The trial of Gemma Lilly and Trudy Linon began on October 2, 2017, at the Supreme Court of Western Australia, and stretched across 5 weeks of evidence that left those in the courtroom visibly shaken. The prosecution laid out the planning, the shopping trips, the messages, the house full of weapons and torture implements. They presented the CCTV footage, the phone records, Linon's own admissions to police. Linon, in her police interview, had admitted to luring Aaron to the house, but maintained she had not expected him to be killed. She described watching Lily attack Aaron, watching the garrote snap under the struggle, watching Lily pin him down with a knife. She said she had helped conceal the body and clean up the evidence, but denied being the one who struck the fatal blows. Lily, for her part, maintained absolute innocence throughout. Her account was that she had last seen Aaron sitting in the living room, that she had gone into a bedroom and fallen asleep, and that she had woken to find Trudy had killed him. She had known nothing, done nothing, been present for nothing. The jury did not believe either of them. In employing what lawyers call a cutthroat defense, each woman pointing the finger at the other in an attempt to escape culpability, both Lily and Linon had effectively destroyed each other's credibility while failing to demolish the evidence. On the 1st of November 2017, after just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts against both women. The courtroom, in those 2 hours of waiting, had held its breath. Aaron's father, Keith Sweetman, had sat through 5 weeks of testimony about his son's final moments, of the garrote, of the defense wounds, of the shallow grave beneath the red tiles. When the verdict came, he spoke to the press with a quiet and dignified grief. "I'm just very glad," he said, "that we've enabled our community to be free of 2 evil people." On February 28, 2018, Justice Stephen Hall sentenced both Gemma Lilly and Trudy Linon to life imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period of 28 years. It was the maximum available punishment for the crime. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Hall did not mince words. He described the murder as morally repugnant, and said the women had killed Aaron Pajich for their own pleasure and in the pitiless pursuit of their own desires. He acknowledged that though it could not be determined with certainty which of the 2 had delivered the fatal wounds, both bore equal responsibility for a crime that had stripped an innocent young man of everything. The word pitiless lingered in the air of the courtroom long after it was spoken, because that, above all else, was what defined what had been done to Aaron Pajich. He had come to a house he believed was safe, to spend time with someone he trusted, to download software and play games and simply exist in the way that young people exist. He had never been given the chance to grow older, to find his way, to build the life that was still unfolding before him. He had been chosen not because of anything he had done or said or been, but because he was trusting, because he was there, and because the woman who killed him needed a victim to satisfy a fantasy she had carried since adolescence. Gemma Lilly attempted to challenge her conviction. On April 10, 2019, her lawyers filed an appeal, arguing that inadmissible evidence had been allowed at trial. The Court of Appeal examined the arguments carefully and, on October 22, 2019, rejected the appeal in full. The conviction stood. She would remain in prison. Inside Bandyup Women's Prison, where both women were initially held, the world outside had not forgotten Aaron Pajich either. On January 1, 2018, just 2 months after the conviction, Trudy Linon was waiting to receive medication when a fellow inmate, an Altgiri Nalina Forrest, approached her and doused her with 2 liters of boiling water. Linon suffered burns to 21% of her body. Forrest later pleaded guilty to causing bodily harm and was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. She told the court she had acted because she was disgusted by what Linon had done. It was a reminder that even within the walls of a prison, a place housing people who had themselves broken society's deepest rules, what had been done to Aaron Pajich was considered monstrous. Aaron Lee Pajich Sweetman had been 18 years old. He had loved video games. He had trusted people. He had lived quietly and openly in a world that had not always been kind to him, navigating his autism with a gentleness that those who loved him remembered vividly. He had not yet had the chance to become fully himself, to discover what he might have built, who he might have loved, what his life in full might have looked like. He had walked through a door on a Monday morning in June, believing he was among friends. That door had been a trap, set by women who had planned his death in advance, who had bought acid and saws and concrete in preparation, who had chosen him not for anything about him, but for everything that made him vulnerable. And when it was over, they had hidden him under tiles in a backyard and gone to work the next day. Justice Hall's words, morally repugnant, pitiless pursuit of their own desires, were not merely legal language. They were a reckoning with a crime that exposed the most unsettling of human truths. That darkness can exist in ordinary places, in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, and that the most trusting among us are sometimes the most exposed to it. Aaron deserved none of what happened to him. His family carried the grief of it forward, and somewhere in the correctional system of Western Australia, 2 women who had dreamed of becoming killers were living with the consequences of a dream they should never have been allowed to realize. Story 5. There is a particular kind of grief that no parent ever fully recovers from, the kind that arrives without warning, reshaping every ordinary moment that came before it into something unbearably precious. For Harkirat and Sarbjit Badalia, it arrived in the early hours of September 28, 2011, in the sterile waiting room of a hospital in British Columbia, Canada. It arrived in the form of a phone call, a uniformed officer, and a silence so absolute it could swallow a lifetime of hope whole. Harkirat Badalia came from India with a simple wish, that his daughters would never have to choose between who they were and who they wanted to become. He and his wife Sarbjit settled in Surrey, British Columbia, a city in the lower mainland that had grown into a rich, multicultural home for countless South Asian immigrant families just like theirs. They built a life carefully, quietly, with the steady determination of people who understood the weight of sacrifice. When his youngest daughter was born, Harkirat named her Maple, after the tree on the Canadian flag, the symbol of the country that had given his family shelter and possibility. It was not just a name. It was a declaration of belonging, a small, beautiful act of gratitude. Maple grew up in a household that was, by the standards of her cultural community, refreshingly open. It has a very non-traditional household, one in which the girls were allowed to go outside, play freely, dream loudly, and pursue their ambitions without apology. She was magnetic, funny, beautiful in a way that seemed entirely unaware of itself. She wanted to be a doctor, an actress, a model, maybe even an astronaut. She never said these things as fantasies. She said them as plans. By the time she was 14 years old, some of those plans were already becoming real. She landed her first runway modeling gig and later walked in Vancouver Fashion Week, navigating a world far beyond what most teenagers dare to enter. She enrolled in acting school, signed with an agent, and began auditioning. The ambition was not just talk. Maple Badalia was someone who worked for what she wanted, who turned her dreams into daily habits, and who, by her late teens, had achieved something that many adults spend their entire lives chasing. She earned a role in the major Hollywood film, appearing on screen in a part that had her and her friends screaming with joy in the theater during the premiere, tears streaming down her cheeks, barely believing that the face on the screen was her own. At the same time, she enrolled in health sciences at Simon Fraser University's Surrey campus. She wanted to be a dermatologist. She was the kind of person who could hold all of these ambitions at once, the artist and the scientist, the dreamer and the diligent student, without any contradiction, because to those who loved her, all of it simply seemed like Maple. It was in this world of growing possibility that she began dating a young man named Gurjinder Dhaliwal, known to most people as Gary. He came from a well-established and respected Punjabi family in the same community, and in the beginning, their relationship had all the warmth of a first love. He brought chocolates and flowers to the Badalia home. He went out of his way to make Maple feel special. The families moved in the same social circles, attended the same temple, shared the same cultural customs. It felt natural. It felt safe. But as Maple's world continued to expand, as her acting career gathered momentum and her academic path became clearer, something inside Gary Dhaliwal began to darken. His friends and Maple's friends noticed it. Where a loving partner would have celebrated her success, Gary grew resentful of it. He was jealous. He wasn't happy for her, like a boyfriend that loves her should be. Her friend Natalie Sheck would later say, "I think he was really jealous of her light, because he didn't have that light in him." After high school, the gap between them widened further. Maple went to university. Gary went to work at his father's trucking business. Their paths, once aligned, were now pointing in entirely different directions. By August 2011, Maple had discovered that Dollywall was being unfaithful to her. The revelation hurt, but it also clarified things. She made the decision to end the relationship. It was, by any reasonable measure, the right decision. A decision made by a young woman with self-respect, good judgment, and her whole life stretching out ahead of her. She could not have known in that moment how dangerous that decision would prove to be. Dollywall did not accept the breakup. He could not, or would not, allow Maple to simply move on. He began contacting her obsessively, calling, messaging, showing up in her life in ways that were persistent and suffocating. Those close to Maple could see that the situation was making her uncomfortable, even frightened. Dollywall was not grieving the loss of a relationship. He was refusing to accept that the relationship was over, and his refusal was beginning to look less like heartbreak and more like something far more threatening. The warning signs escalated sharply in the days before September 28th. Maple had gone to a coffee shop with a male friend named Dylan. Nothing romantic, just two people studying and spending time together. Dollywall found out and arrived at the coffee shop in a state of fury. He confronted Maple in front of others, demanding to know who Dylan was, accusing her of moving on, his voice rising with every question. He was yelling at me, "What are you doing? Do you like this guy?" Maple later told police. And he finally just pushed me. And so I was really shaking and was really scared. This time, the police became involved. Dollywall was arrested following the incident and was issued a court order, a no-contact order that legally compelled him to stay away from Maple Badalia. In theory, this was protection, a legal boundary drawn by the justice system between a frightened young woman and the person frightening her. In practice, that boundary was about to mean nothing at all. 3 days passed. On the night of September 27, 2011, which stretched into the early hours of September 28th, the Surrey campus of Simon Fraser University was quiet in the way that university campuses become quiet very late at night. Not fully empty, but still with clusters of students tucked into study rooms, the library humming softly with focused concentration, the parking lots lit under pale artificial light. Maple was there with her friend Karen Kong, studying. It was the kind of ordinary, unglamorous evening that marks most of a student's life. Coffee, books, fluorescent lights, the gentle pressure of an upcoming exam. At some point during the evening, the two friends had briefly stepped out to a nearby coffee shop, then returned to the library. Nothing was unusual. Nothing was alarming. What neither Maple nor Karen could have known was that somewhere in the shadows of that campus, a white Dodge Charger, rented just days earlier, had been circling. The vehicle belonged, officially, to Dollywall's friend Gursamar Beatty, also known as Gary Beatty, who had rented it from an Avis location in the days prior. Surveillance cameras on campus captured the same white Charger following Maple and Karen as they had walked briefly to the coffee shop. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. Just after 1 o'clock in the morning, Maple Badalia left the campus library alone and began walking toward the parking lot where her car was parked. The air was cool. The campus was nearly empty. She was walking across a university campus after a late-night study session, thinking perhaps about the drive home, about tomorrow's classes, about her life and its many open doors. Then the shots rang out. Multiple gunshots broke the silence of the campus, each one irreversible. The sound drew the attention of a handful of students who had been nearby, their late nights suddenly transformed into something they would never forget. Royal Canadian Mounted Police Corporal Daniel Johnson was among the first officers to arrive at the scene. What he found when he reached the parking lot was a sight that would stay with him for the rest of his career. Maple was on the ground, bleeding heavily, her body bearing both gunshot wounds and severe stab wounds to her head. She had been shot at 5 times. 3 bullets had struck her torso. There were 11 separate cuts on the top and back of her head. The ferocity of the attack, both the gun and the knife, both the distance and the intimacy of violence, told a story of rage that was deeply personal. Miraculously, Maple still had a pulse. Johnson knelt beside her, trying to keep her conscious, speaking to her, willing her to hold on. She tried to speak to him. She opened her mouth, tried to form words, but the blood from her injuries made it impossible. He could not understand what she was trying to say. I remember telling her I was going to do everything that I could in my powers and my training to try and save her, Johnson said later, his voice carrying the particular sorrow of a person who gave everything and still could not give enough. Maple Battaglia was rushed to Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. Emergency medical teams worked urgently to stabilize her, to hold back the tide of damage that the bullets and the blade had wrought on a body that was, just an hour earlier, perfectly healthy and alive. But the injuries were too severe, too numerous, too catastrophically destructive. At 9:07 in the evening on September 28, 2011, the doctors in the ICU pronounced Maple Battaglia dead. The officers who had to deliver this news to her family described it as one of the most harrowing moments of their professional lives. Sergeant Tyner Gillies of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was there when Harkirat and Sarbjit were told that their daughter, their maple, their Canadian maple tree, their youngest child, was gone. Sarbjit Batalia's reaction was not the quiet, collapsed grief that people sometimes imagine in those moments. It was something far more primal, far more human. She grabbed the back of Gillies' head and pulled him toward her so that their foreheads were touching, and she screamed into his face, "Bring me vengeance." It was not just the rage of a mother. It was a demand, a command, a mother's last act of protection for a daughter she could no longer protect. The investigation began immediately. Given the savage and targeted nature of the attack, investigators from the outset suspected a personal motive. Maple had recently broken up with Gurjinder Dhaliwal. He had been violent with her days earlier. He had been ordered by a court to stay away. The logic of suspicion pointed in one direction with uncomfortable clarity. But suspicion is not evidence, and building a case against Dhaliwal proved to be a slow, painstaking process that would take over a year. The campus surveillance footage offered an early clue. A camera that had been capturing the area of the parking lot where the attack occurred panned away from Maple just seconds before the shots were fired. A devastating accident of timing. But other cameras on campus had captured something important. A white Dodge Charger with distinctive racing-style tail lights had been seen earlier in the evening, following Maple and Karen on their walk to the coffee shop. The same white Charger was seen speeding out of the parking lot immediately after the gunfire. The footage was not conclusive on its own, but the car was distinctive enough that investigators believed they could trace it. Using the characteristic tail lights, investigators determined the vehicle was a 2011 model. They requested records on every white Dodge Charger from that year registered in British Columbia. One car came back traced to an Avis rental, and the rental had been made just days before the murder by Gursamar Beatty, Dhaliwal's close friend. Investigators raced to the rental company and arrived just in time. The car had already been returned and was moments away from being cleaned. Forensic technicians went over the vehicle with extraordinary care. Hidden in the undercarriage of the hood, they found a spent 9mm shell casing. Ballistic testing confirmed that it matched the casings recovered at the crime scene. Tiny spots of blood were found in the car, and DNA analysis confirmed they belonged to Maple. Gunshot residue was found on the steering wheel, placing the weapon inside the vehicle. The white Dodge Charger was no longer just a suspicious vehicle. It was a piece of the crime scene on wheels. Additional surveillance footage showed Dhaliwal himself accompanying Beatty to the Avis rental office when the car was first rented, placing him in the picture from the very beginning. Footage from the campus also showed Beatty stepping out of the passenger side of the vehicle earlier in the evening and entering a campus building, while separately being seen following Dylan, the same male friend who had been with Maple shortly before her death. The pieces were assembling themselves into a damning architecture. Still, investigators needed to place Dhaliwal behind the wheel at the time of the shooting. Forensic analysis of the crime scene determined that the shots had been fired from the driver's seat of the vehicle. Cell phone records, obtained after months of legal process, placed Dhaliwal's phone at the scene of the murder at the time it occurred, and then showed his phone moving away from campus in the minutes immediately following the shooting. Gurjinder Dhaliwal and Gursamar Bedi were arrested on December 1st, 2012, more than 14 months after Maple's death. But even in custody, Dhaliwal did not immediately confess. Investigators tried for hours to get him to talk, showing him photographs of Maple, hoping something would break through. Nothing did, and so they tried something that no investigator's training prepares them for. They asked Maple's mother to help. Sarbjit Badalia, the woman who had screamed into a police officer's face for vengeance, the woman who had been living inside the worst grief imaginable for over a year, agreed to speak to Dhaliwal by phone while he sat in the interrogation room. The conversation she had with him was not what anyone might have expected from a mother who had lost a child so violently. It was not fury. It was not accusation. Instead, Sarbjit spoke to him with an astonishing, heartbreaking gentleness. "Please tell me the truth, son," she said. She told him she did not want harm to come to him. She told him she missed her daughter and needed to know what had happened. And then she offered him something that she had no obligation to offer: forgiveness. "We are humans," she told him. "Whatever mistakes we make, God still forgives us. You are my son. I forgive you." Sitting in the interrogation room, Gurjinder Dhaliwal began to cry. "I'm very sorry," he said quietly. It was not a full confession, but it was enough. Combined with the accumulated weight of forensic evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and the visible timeline of his harassment and threats toward Maple, it gave prosecutors what they needed to proceed. The legal process that followed was long. It was not until March 2016, nearly 5 years after Maple was murdered, that Dhaliwal appeared in court and entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. The courtroom that day was filled with Maple's family and friends, who had been waiting through years of hearings, adjournments, legal maneuvers, and the grinding patience that the justice system demands from those who have already suffered the most. The impact statements they delivered were raw and unflinching. They addressed Dhaliwal directly. "You said you loved her," one of them said, looking him in the eye across the courtroom. Crown Prosecutor Wendy Stevens laid out the motive clearly for the court. Dhaliwal had killed Maple Badalia because she had chosen to leave him, specifically because she discovered he had been repeatedly unfaithful to her. The fact that the murder was committed in the direct context of a relationship breakdown was cited as an aggravating factor, a recognition that this was not simply a crime of passion, but an act of control, of punishment, of a man who believed he had the right to decide whether his partner could leave. Justice Terence Schultz sentenced Gurjinder Dhaliwal to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 21 years. His friend Gursamar Bedi, who had rented the vehicle and had been present on campus that night, was convicted as an accessory after the fact and received 18 months behind bars. For Maple's family, the sentence was simultaneously the closest thing to justice they could receive and a measure that would never feel sufficient. "I felt like a chance of parole after 21 years still gives Gary a good chance at life," Rosaline said. And the measly couple of months, that his friend got, as the last potential person that could have stopped him, was a smack in the face. But nothing will bring her back. Nothing will bring her back. In the years since, Maple Batalia's family has devoted themselves to making sure her name carries forward, not only as the name of a victim, but as the name of a dreamer, a daughter, an actress, a student, a girl who wanted to be a doctor and an astronaut and a model, all at once, and who managed to be all of those things before the age of 20. A scholarship was established in her name by House of Kiran, ensuring that other young women with big dreams would be supported in pursuing them. Her story has been shared in schools across the Fraser Cascade district, not as a cautionary tale, but as a portrait of someone worth remembering, and as a warning about the patterns of obsession, jealousy, and control that can precede deadly violence. Her father, Harkirat Badalia, speaks of her with a grief that has been shaped, over the years, into something that holds both sorrow and love without collapsing under their combined weight. "Because you cannot count the maple tree leaves of this universe in Canada," he has said. "Maple's soul will never die. She is always in our heart." There is a campus parking lot in Surrey, British Columbia, that most students move through without a second thought. They pull in and out, thinking about exams and weekends and the small logistics of a student life. Most of them will never know that in the early hours of a September morning, a 19-year-old woman who had already appeared in a Hollywood film, who had walked runways and dreamed of medical school, who had been given her name as an act of love by a father who wanted her to belong to something great, walked through that lot for the last time. Maple Batalia's story is, in the end, a story about what is taken when violence reaches into the life of someone full of light. It is a story about the cruelty of jealousy left unchecked, about the insufficiency of the legal protections available to women trying to escape controlling partners, and about the courage of a mother who could find enough grace, even in the depths of unthinkable grief, to speak tenderly to the person responsible, because the truth mattered more than anger. It is a story that deserves to be told carefully, honestly, and in full, because Maple Batalia was not simply a case number or a crime headline. She was a person. She was, as those who loved her said, a jewel, and the world is demonstrably lesser for her absence from it. Story 6. There is a fear that detectives feel when the pieces of a case begin to form a pattern, when what seemed like isolated incidents, scattered across different counties and different seasons, reveal themselves to be chapters in a single, ongoing story. In the late 1990s, that fear settled over the California Highway Patrol and the law enforcement agencies of Humboldt, Kern, San Joaquin, and San Bernardino counties as bodies began appearing in the waterways that thread through the California interior. Each one was a woman. Each one was found naked. Each one had been discarded like something without value, lowered into a canal or a slough or a stretch of slow-moving water, and left for the current to deal with. And in one case, the body was not merely discarded, but had been taken apart, separated into pieces as though the person who had done it wanted to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to reassemble the truth. Nobody knew yet that all of it was the work of one man. Nobody knew that he was out there still, driving the long, flat highways in a semi-truck, moving between cities with the freedom that a professional trucker's life allows. No fixed schedule, no one waiting for him at the end of each day. The whole of California spread open before him like a map with no borders. Nobody knew that he was already aware, somewhere in the geography of his own interior, that what he was doing was wrong. That the conflict between what he had become and what he believed himself to be was building towards some kind of rupture. Nobody knew that the man responsible for those discarded bodies in those California waterways would eventually walk into a sheriff's office and hand over the most disturbing piece of evidence any detective had ever received across a front desk. But that is how the story of Wayne Adam Ford ends. First, you have to understand how it began. Wayne Adam Ford was born on December 3, 1961, in Petaluma, California, a small city in Sonoma County, not far from the fog-draped edge of the Pacific. His early life was not the blank, uneventful childhood of a man who seems, in retrospect, like he was always going to turn out fine. It was, instead, marked by instability, by the kind of household where a child learns early that the adults around them cannot be fully relied upon. He grew up absorbing that lesson, carrying it into adolescence, and then into young adulthood with the invisible loyalty that damaged children sometimes maintain toward the dynamics that shaped them. He served in the United States Marine Corps, a chapter of his life that he would later describe with pride, one of the few anchors of self-respect he seemed to hold onto through the unraveling years. After the military, he moved through the American West with the restlessness of a man who had not yet found the thing that would hold him in one place. He lived in Big Bear and San Clemente, drifted to Las Vegas, married, had a son. The marriage, like most of the structured things in his life, did not hold. He and his wife separated, and Wayne lost something in that dissolution that he would later describe with genuine grief. Access to his boy, the specific daily ordinariness of being a father that he had wanted and believed he could sustain. After the separation, he moved north to the California coast, to Arcata, a quiet college town at the southern edge of Humboldt County, where the redwood forests press close to the edges of things, and the gray Pacific light softens the outlines of the world. He found work as a long-haul truck driver. It was a job that suited the solitary, untethered quality of his life. Long stretches of highway, no boss watching over his shoulder, the road always ahead of him. The cities and deserts and agricultural valleys of California scrolling past the window with the indifferent beauty of a place too vast to fully register. He drove. He was alone. And something in him, something that had been accumulating for years, fed by the head injury he had suffered when he had stopped to help someone and had been struck, an injury that, by his own account and those of people who knew him, altered his personality in ways he could not fully control, was moving toward a terrible expression. In October 1997, near the city of Eureka, California, the largest city in Humboldt County, built at the edge of a broad bay where the Mad River feeds into the Pacific, the torso of a young woman was discovered in a marshy slough. It was a horrifying discovery on its own terms, but the details of what had been done to the body elevated it into something that even seasoned investigators struggled to process. The head, the arms, the legs, and both breasts had been removed. The torso had been stabbed 27 times and cut down the middle. The woman had been, in the truest sense of a terrible word, obliterated. Whoever had done this had not simply committed a murder. They had committed what appeared to be an attempt to unmake a person, to reduce a human being to a puzzle with no solution. She had no identification. She had no name. She would be entered into the records simply as Jane Doe, a designation as cold and incomplete as the discovery itself. Investigators circulated descriptions. They made inquiries. They hit walls. The identity of the woman in the Eureka Slough would remain one of the enduring mysteries of the case for decades. So long, in fact, that it would eventually take a technology that did not exist at the time of her death to finally give her back her name. While Humboldt County investigators worked their unidentifiable Jane Doe with the patient frustration that cold cases demand, other bodies were appearing elsewhere in the state. In 1998, the body of a woman named Tina Renee Gibbs was found in an aqueduct in Kern County, in the parched inland region south of the San Joaquin Valley. She was 26 years old, from Las Vegas, and she had been working as a sex worker when she disappeared. Wayne Ford would later tell investigators that he had encountered Gibbs in Las Vegas, and that her death had occurred during a sexual encounter that involved bondage, and that she had not survived. He had then driven her body across state lines, a detail that added federal dimensions to an already multi-jurisdictional case. There was also Lynette White, from Fontana, whose body was found in a canal near Lodi in San Joaquin County. Ford would later describe picking White up at an Ontario truck stop in San Bernardino County and driving with her body tied in his truck to Phoenix before returning to California and disposing of her near Lodi. And Patricia Tamez, 29 years old, from Hesperia, whose body was found in the California aqueduct near Hesperia in October 1998. Her death the most recent, her fate the one that would directly precipitate the event that broke the case open. For women, for different counties, for sets of investigators, each working their own file, each unaware of how precisely their case mirrored the others, unaware that the truck still moving along California's highways was carrying the same driver responsible for all of them. The California Wayne Adam Ford occupied in those years was not a world of obvious menace. He did not appear monstrous in the way that popular imagination sometimes assigns to people who do monstrous things. He was large, physically imposing, the kind of man whose presence fills a room. But he moved through the world with a vulnerability that people found surprising and sometimes disarming. He cried easily. He described himself as someone who believed in God, who felt the weight of his choices, who was not at peace with the person he was becoming. He told people he had done terrible things. He hinted, in the way that someone might hint who does not yet have the courage for full disclosure, that there were things in his past that he could not live with. The tension within him, between the violence he was committing on those dark California highways and the conscience that had apparently never gone fully silent, was, according to those who later analyzed his psychology, a defining characteristic. He was not, investigators and psychologists would later note, indifferent to what he had done. He was in agony about it. Whether that agony was genuine or self-serving, whether the tears he shed in interviews represented real remorse or the performance of remorse, is a question that the courts and the families of his victims weighed very differently. But the anguish appeared, at least superficially, to be real. By the autumn of 1998, it had become unbearable. On November 2nd, 1998, a Monday, Wayne Adam Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department in Eureka, California. He did not come alone. He had called his brother Rodney, who lived in Vallejo, and asked him to come with him. Whether he needed a witness to ensure he did not lose his nerve, or whether he simply could not face what he was about to do entirely on his own. Rodney agreed and drove to meet him. The two brothers walked through the door of the sheriff's department together, and Wayne stepped up to the front desk. He told the deputy on duty that he had hurt a lot of people. He said he wanted to turn himself in. And then, in an act so startling, so far outside the ordinary parameters of a law enforcement intake that the deputy who witnessed it would describe it in subsequent interviews with a kind of stunned disbelief, Wayne Adam Ford reached into the pocket of his jacket and placed a plastic bag on the counter. Inside the bag was a woman's body parts. It belonged to Patricia Tamez. He had kept it. For how long and why, the record does not cleanly answer, but the forensic analysis that followed confirmed the tissue's origin. It was physical proof, offered voluntarily, placed on a counter with the deliberate simplicity of a man who had made a decision and had decided to make it irrevocable. The deputy stared at what was on the counter. Then he called for his supervisors. The hours that followed were unlike almost anything in California law enforcement's recent history. Wayne Ford was taken into custody, and the questioning began, not as an interrogation in the conventional sense, because the man across the table was not refusing to talk. He was, in fact, desperate to talk. He broke down into tears repeatedly during the 3-hour intake interview with Humboldt County Coroner Frank Yeager, who would later tell reporters that Ford struck him as very remorseful and very ashamed, a disposition unlike any homicide suspect he had previously encountered. Ford talked about his crimes. He talked about the women. He described where he had left them, the counties and the waterways, the specific circumstances of each encounter. He confessed to the murder of the unidentified woman whose dismembered torso had been found in the Eureka Slough in October 1997, the Jane Doe that Humboldt County investigators had been trying to identify for more than a year. He had been the one who took her apart. He described picking her up while she was hitchhiking near Eureka, near midnight, and driving with her to Clam Beach on the northern edge of town. He told investigators what had happened there, and then he told them what he had done afterward. The coroner, processing the information with the professional composure that his work demanded, noted down the details with a steadiness that the circumstances must have made very difficult to maintain. Ford also confessed to the murders of Tina Gibbs, Lynette White, and Patricia Tamez. He told investigators the general shape of each encounter, each woman picked up in a location associated with his trucking routes, each death occurring, by his account, during sexual encounters that turned fatal. He maintained, in the language that his defense would later repeat and his prosecutors would vigorously contest, that the deaths had not been intentional, that he had engaged in a practice of choking women and reviving them during physical relations, and that 4 women had not been revived. He had attempted CPR. He had failed. And then he had disposed of their bodies in the waterways that lined his routes, naked, without identification, discarded like trash. The district attorneys across 4 California counties moved quickly once the confession was in hand. A new California law allowing serial killings to be consolidated into a single trial, rather than prosecuted separately in each individual county, had recently been enacted, and after considerable legal debate about its applicability to Ford's case, the decision was made to try all 4 murders together in San Bernardino County. It was a choice that would shape the next several years of proceedings, and would give the families of 4 victims one courtroom, one verdict, and one moment of collective reckoning, rather than 4 separate, drawn-out ordeals. The legal road between Wayne Ford's November 1998 confession and his trial was long, tangled, and frequently delayed, a characteristic of major capital cases that the families of victims experience as its own form of cruelty. Jurisdictional questions had to be resolved. Ford's defense team, led by attorney Joseph D. Caney, fought to have his confession suppressed, arguing that they had been obtained in violation of Ford's right to legal counsel, that he had asked for a lawyer and had not been given one promptly enough. The prosecution countered that Ford had voluntarily continued talking, that he had changed his mind about requesting counsel and chosen to confess freely. In January 2004, Superior Court Judge Michael Smith ruled that most of Ford's confessions were admissible, but that those made after the 3rd day of questioning, which included some statements about Lynette White, could not be used by the prosecution. It was a partial victory for the defense, but not enough to fundamentally alter the weight of evidence against Ford, which included not only his own extensive statements but physical evidence, geographic and forensic connections between the victims and the routes he drove, and the extraordinary fact that he had walked into a police station with human remains in his pocket. The trial itself did not begin until 2006, nearly 8 years after Ford's surrender. The delays had accumulated through the long, grinding machinery of the California courts. Changes in prosecution personnel, scheduling complications, the sheer complexity of a multi-county capital case. By the time Deputy District Attorney Dave Mazurek stood before the San Bernardino County jury to deliver the prosecution's opening argument, the families of the 4 victims had been waiting for almost a decade. Mazurek described each woman to the jury. He talked about what had been done to them, and about the manner in which they had been disposed of. He showed the jury the severed breast that had been in Ford's jacket pocket on the day he turned himself in, introducing it into evidence as what it was: proof of both the crime and the confession, a piece of physical reality that could not be explained away. He told the jury that Wayne Adam Ford knew exactly what he had done, and that he knew what he was. The defense did not dispute that Ford had killed 4 women. The argument they offered was one of mitigation: the head injury, the psychological damage, the personality changes that had followed it, the genuine remorse that Ford had demonstrated by surrendering voluntarily, by walking through that door in Eureka with his evidence and his confession and his brother beside him. They argued that a man who had turned himself in deserved some consideration for that act, that death was not the proportionate response to a crime in which the perpetrator had ultimately helped investigators close their cases and, eventually, bring some closure to the families of his victims. The prosecution disagreed. The families of the victims, many of whom sat through the entire trial with the composed grief of people who have decided that the only remaining thing they can do for their loved ones is bear witness, disagreed as well. On June 27, 2006, after a trial that had stretched over months, the jury returned its verdict. Wayne Adam Ford was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The conviction covered all 4 victims: the Jane Doe from the Eureka Slough, Tina Renee Gibbs, Lynette White, and Patricia Tamez. For women whose lives had been ended on California's dark highways, whose bodies had been left in California's water. For women who had been given back their names, or, in the case of Jane Doe, who were still waiting for theirs. In August 2006, the penalty phase concluded. The same jury that had convicted Ford considered the question of whether he should live or die for what he had done, weighing the prosecution's argument that death was the only appropriate sentence against the defense's portrait of a damaged, remorseful man who had ultimately chosen to confess. They chose death. Wayne Adam Ford was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin State Prison in California, where he has remained on death row. The question of the Jane Doe from the Eureka Slough, the first victim, the most brutally treated, the one whose identity had eluded investigators for years, remained open for 2.5 decades. Modern forensic technology eventually provided the answer. In 2023, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office, using genetic genealogy, a technique that involves mapping a victim's DNA against publicly available genealogical databases to identify family connections, finally identified the young woman whose torso had been found in October 1997. She had a name. She had a family. She had been waiting, in the anonymous category of Jane Doe, for 25 years to be given back the most basic thing a person carries through the world: the knowledge of who they are. The case of Wayne Adam Ford occupies an uncomfortable, particular space in the history of American criminal investigation because it does not fit the neat categories that help people understand and process such cases. He was not caught through brilliant detective work or a forensic breakthrough. He was caught because he walked in. Because, on a November morning in 1998, some portion of him could no longer carry the weight of what he had done, and he made the decision that no investigator had been positioned to make for him. He chose to end it himself. What that means, what it says about guilt and conscience and the human capacity for both terrible violence and genuine self-recrimination, is not a question the law is designed to answer. The law is designed to establish facts and apply consequences, and it did both. For murders, 1 guilty verdict, 1 death sentence. But the deeper question of what Wayne Adam Ford was, not the legal category but the human reality, the specific and unresolved tangle of damage and violence and apparent remorse, is the one that lingers when the courtroom empties and the formal record is closed. For Tina Gibbs, for Lynette White, for Patricia Tamez, and for the woman from the Eureka Slough who waited 25 years to be named, those questions are secondary. What mattered to them, and to the people who loved them, was simpler and more devastating than any psychological framework. They had lives, and those lives were taken from them on the dark highways of a California night, by a man who drove alone and who knew, even as he drove, that what he was doing was wrong. That knowledge, preserved in his own confessions, in the tears he shed across a coroner's table in Humboldt County, and in the extraordinary act of walking into a police station to end what he could no longer justify continuing, is the thing that makes his case not just a crime story, but a human one. Broken, irreparable, and fully without excuse. But human nonetheless. Story 7. The chill of a Michigan February had settled deep into the soil of Branch County, a landscape of frosted fields and stark, skeletal trees. On Saturday, February 7th, 2009, the air over Girard Township was damp and heavy, the ground a muddy soup from a winter thaw. It was here, on a sprawling property known affectionately as Heath Bar Farm, that the threads of a seemingly ordinary life began to unravel into a tapestry of violence, suspicion, and enduring mystery. The farm, a 2-story brick house on Girard Road, was home to the Foley family, Tom, his wife Darlene, and their 10-year-old son Heath. Darlene, known to everyone as Dar, was the heart of this home and a cherished fixture in the nearby community of Union City. At 41, she was a woman whose life was a testament to quiet kindness and unwavering generosity. For 19 years, she had been a beloved elementary school teacher, a gentle guide for countless young minds. Her niece, Amber Rappelia, remembered her aunt as the embodiment of peace, love, and happiness, a person so full of life that her absence would leave a crater in their world. This was a woman who, upon learning her 13-year-old niece needed a kidney transplant, immediately declared, "I'm going to be the one to give you that kidney." Dar was the kind of person you couldn't imagine anyone wanting to harm, which made what happened next all the more incomprehensible. Tom Foley, her husband of nearly 15 years, was a well-known figure in the area, once considered a hometown hero. Their life at Heath Bar Farm, named for their son, appeared idyllic from the outside. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form in the foundation of their marriage. The couple had been experiencing difficulties for about 2 years. They argued frequently, and Tom had confessed to Dar that he no longer loved her. He had even engaged in flirtatious behavior with one of Dar's co-workers, a brief dalliance that he later admitted to his wife. Though they had sought counseling and were attempting to work through their problems, a shadow lingered over their relationship. The day of the murder began with the mundane rhythm of family life. Tom and Dar took Heath to a basketball game in Marshall, followed by a shopping trip in Battle Creek, before returning to their farm. In the afternoon, as the gray light began to fade, Heath was outside playing with a friend, Skylar Waddy. The boys were near the barn when a sudden, loud noise shattered the rural quiet. It sounded, they later said, like thunder or a pane of glass shattering, and it came directly from the house, near the first-floor bathroom. They investigated, but saw nothing amiss. Tom would later offer an explanation for the sound. He claimed he had been moving some old, salvaged windows from the side of the house to the barn. One of the frames, he said, slipped from his grasp, and the glass pane shattered on the back steps. He told the boys everything was fine. A police investigator would later find the windows in the barn and a piece of the broken glass in a flower garden, where Tom said he had placed it while cleaning up. But the prosecution would come to believe that the sharp, explosive sound the boys heard was not breaking glass, but the fatal blast of a shotgun. Shortly before 4 p.m., Tom Foley gathered the two boys. It was Heath's birthday party, and they were heading to a friend's house in Union City to celebrate. Tom dropped the boys off around 4:20 p.m. and then left, saying he needed to get some ice. The homeowner at the party later recalled that Tom seemed nervous and jittery. He was gone for about 15 minutes. Dar was supposed to follow them to the party, bringing 2 other children with her. As the clock ticked past 5 p.m., and with no sign of his wife, Tom began to express concern. He made a series of phone calls, checking with the parents of the other children to see if Dar had arrived to pick them up. She hadn't. Curiously, the one place he didn't call was his own house. Dar didn't own a cell phone, so the landline was the only way to reach her at the farm. The prosecutor would later argue that Tom didn't call home because he already knew no one would answer. His professed anxiety growing, Tom left the party and drove the few miles back to Heath Bar Farm to check on his wife. At 5:20 p.m., a frantic, breathless Tom Foley called 911. He told the dispatcher he had found his wife, that something was terribly wrong. He had found her in the shower, he said, murdered. When law enforcement arrived, they stepped into a scene of controlled chaos. The house appeared to have been burglarized. A window on the back door leading to the kitchen was broken, a glass beer bottle lying shattered nearby as the likely instrument of entry. Parts of the home had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, and papers were strewn about. Some items were missing: credit cards, financial papers from a desk, and a video game. But investigators noted that expensive electronics, the typical targets of a hurried burglary, were left untouched. The heart of the crime scene was the first-floor bathroom. There, in the shower stall, lay the naked body of Darlene Foley. She had been shot once in the head at close range, the weapon likely a high-powered shotgun fired from about 6 inches away. Tom told police he had turned off the shower when he found her, but a chilling detail was immediately apparent to the first responders. The bathtub and the surrounding area were completely dry. It did not appear as though the shower had been running at all. The investigation, led by Michigan State Police Detective James Carbon, quickly zeroed in on Tom Foley. The staged appearance of the burglary raised immediate red flags. It felt too neat, too selective. To investigators, it looked less like the work of a desperate intruder and more like a clumsy attempt to misdirect them. The theory that began to solidify was a dark one. Tom had killed his wife before he ever left for the party, returned home after dropping off the boys, hastily staged a break-in, and then made the discovery of her body. The circumstantial evidence against him began to mount, piece by damning piece. The troubled state of their marriage provided a potential motive, as did a life insurance policy that would pay out $280,000 upon Dar's death. Then came a crucial piece of information from Dar's own family. Her brother, Brian Weber, told police that a 12-gauge shotgun had been stolen from his gun locker in the summer of 2008, several months before the murder. He hadn't reported it stolen because he assumed a friend or family member had borrowed it. Tom Foley, as his brother-in-law, would have had access to that gun locker. The murder weapon itself was never found, but 2 plastic shotgun shell wads were recovered from the bathroom floor. The most tangible piece of evidence was discovered in the basement of the Foley home, accessible through a door in the very bathroom where Dar was killed. There, detectives found a clean plastic bag containing 3 unused 12-gauge shotgun shells, the same type owned by Dar's brother. The bag stood out, looking pristine compared to the other dusty items in the basement. And on the outside of that bag, investigators found a clear fingerprint, Tom Foley's right index finger. The prosecutor, Terry Norris, would later call this the critical mistake of a man who had never killed before. Forensic analysis of Tom's clothing revealed another small but significant clue. A tiny stain of Dar's blood was found on his shirt. A forensic analyst testified that the stain was not from high-velocity blood spatter, the kind one would expect from a close-range gunshot, but was the result of contact with blood. This meant Tom could have gotten it on his shirt by touching Dar's body or a bloodied surface after she was shot. However, the defense would hammer home a crucial point. There was no gunpowder residue, no blood spatter, no other physical evidence on Tom's clothing or his person to suggest he had fired the fatal shot. If he had shot his wife from 6 inches away, how had he managed to escape without a trace of the violent act on him? His pants were never taken into evidence or tested. Both Heath and his friend Skylar told police that Tom was wearing the same clothes all day, and that they never saw him clean up or change between the time they heard the loud bang and when they left for the party. On March 6, 2009, less than a month after his wife's death, Tom Foley was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and felony firearm possession. His trial began in November of that year, a proceeding that would captivate and divide the small Michigan community. The prosecution, led by Terry Norris, laid out their case with methodical precision. They painted a picture of a failing marriage, a husband who felt trapped and had his eye on another woman. They presented the financial motive of the insurance money and the string of circumstantial clues. The stolen shotgun he had access to, the shells in the basement with his fingerprint, the blood on his shirt, and his strange behavior on the day of the murder, particularly his failure to call home. They argued that the loud noise the boys heard was the gunshot, and that Tom's story about the broken window was a lie fabricated to cover his tracks. Tom's defense attorney, J. Thomas Schaefer, countered aggressively. He argued that the police had suffered from tunnel vision, focusing exclusively on Tom from the very beginning at the expense of other leads. He attacked the lack of direct physical evidence connecting Tom to the shooting. How could a man fire a shotgun at point-blank range and emerge spotless? Schaefer insisted that the burglary was real and that an unknown intruder had killed Dar. He even had a witness, Kenneth Brownell, who testified that sometime between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m. on the day of the murder, he had seen an older model white or light-colored car backing out of the Foley driveway at a high rate of speed. The driver, he said, was a white male with bushy hair. This, the defense argued, was the real killer making his escape. Tom Foley took the stand in his own defense, maintaining his innocence throughout the trial. But the jury of 9 men and 3 women found the prosecution's narrative more compelling. After deliberating for the better part of 2 days, they returned with a verdict on November 27, 2009, guilty on all counts. Tom Foley stood expressionless as the verdict was read, his face a mask of stone. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Dar's family, it was a just conclusion. Her niece Amber spoke for them, stating unequivocally, "We know who did it, and he's still out there," referring to Tom living as a free man after his later acquittal. But for Tom and his supporters, the fight was far from over. And then, after the conviction, came the bombshell. With Tom Foley serving a life sentence, his defense team received a series of unexpected calls. 3 new witnesses came forward, people who had seen something strange at Heath Bar Farm on that fateful February afternoon, but had, for various reasons, remained silent. Their stories would corroborate and expand upon the testimony of the lone trial witness who saw a mysterious car. This newly discovered evidence was enough for the trial court to grant Tom Foley's motion for a new trial, a stunning reversal that gave him a second chance at freedom. At an evidentiary hearing, the new witnesses painted a compelling picture. Terry McCluffin testified that at around 3:30 p.m., he saw a dark SUV-type vehicle parked near a barn on the Foley property, a vehicle he knew didn't belong there and which would not have been visible from the house. Jacqueline Gibson testified that at about 4 p.m., she saw a white, mid-size, 1990s model car parked in the driveway behind Dar's own car. Most dramatically, Jeanette Moore testified that at approximately 4:45 p.m., well after Tom had already left for the party, she was driving past the farm when an older white car came racing out of the driveway, driving forward at such a high speed that she had to slam on her brakes to avoid a collision. She described the driver as a young man, perhaps 18 to 20 years old, with curly black hair and a long face. The appellate court agreed with the trial judge that this new evidence was not merely cumulative. It substantially bolstered the defense's theory of an unknown intruder. The witnesses described different vehicles, or the same vehicle at different times and in different positions, suggesting a sustained presence at the farm during the time frame of the murder. The court noted that the case against Tom was entirely circumstantial, and that an acquittal in the first trial would have been just as reasonable as a conviction. Tom Foley's retrial took place in July 2011. This time, the defense came armed with the testimony of the new witnesses. They created a powerful narrative of another person, or perhaps multiple people, present at the farm, and a white car seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution's case, which had seemed so solid, now appeared to have significant holes. The jury at the second trial saw reasonable doubt where the first jury had seen certainty. They came back with a verdict that shocked the prosecution and Dar's family to their core, not guilty. Tom Foley walked out of prison a free man, cleared of his wife's murder. But freedom did not mean peace. The case was now officially unsolved, a cold file in the cabinets of the Michigan State Police. The police, for their part, made it clear that from their perspective, the investigation was concluded. They had followed the evidence, it had led them to Tom Foley, and they remained confident that he was where the answers lay. Due to the principle of double jeopardy, he could never be tried for Dar's murder again. In the years that followed, the chasm between Tom Foley and Dar's family only widened. Tom, proclaiming his innocence and calling on the police to properly investigate the crime and find his wife's real killer. He pointed to leads he felt were ignored, such as an attempt to use one of the stolen credit cards in Kalamazoo weeks after he was already in jail, a lead the authorities never pursued. Dar's family saw the book as a grotesque exploitation of her death, an arrogant act by a man they still believed was a murderer. Tom Foley has spent years trying to rebuild his life and his relationship with his son, Heath, the boy who lost his mother and nearly lost his father to a life sentence. He maintains that his mission is to get justice for Dar and for his son, who deserves to know the truth. Other theories have swirled in the vacuum left by Tom's acquittal. There was talk of a meth mob and a possibility that Dar, in her role as a teacher and advocate for her students, may have made enemies. She had testified against potentially abusive parents on more than one occasion, even taking out a restraining order against one father. Could this have been a motive for a revenge killing? Police have also named a person of interest, a man named Nicholas Young, though he has not been charged. But for the authorities, the case remains closed. For Dar's family, the killer walks free. For Tom Foley, his name is cleared, but his life is forever stained. And in the quiet heart of Michigan, the murder of Darlene Foley at Heath Bar Farm remains a haunting, unresolved tragedy, a story with a beginning and a middle, but no end. The question that hangs over the frosted fields is the same one that has haunted Union City for years. If Tom Foley didn't kill his wife, who did?